Good afternoon and welcome to St. Joseph's University Unlimited Learning Series. My name is Kristen Print. I'm from the class of 2004, getting old. I will be your host today, and I'm the executive director and founder of Lucy Outreach, which is lifting up Camden's youth, a youth development center in Camden, New Jersey. So of course, I am especially excited and interested to hear from our guest panelists today and to learn right along with each of you. Today, we'll be discussing why we give, answering questions about the motivations and behaviors behind charitable giving, and the ethical decision-making process, followed by questions submitted by you, the audience. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this series. A key element of St. Joseph's University mission is certainly the commitment to lifelong learning. That mission is led to create the Unlimited series, which is today's interactive discussion on why we give, philanthropy and decision making. I want to thank the university for coordinating today's event. The team was so organized, really worked well to support each of us and giving us the space to have this discussion and talk about such an important topic. Also, thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join us, and we look forward to hearing from each of you. I'm joined today by two experts, Dr. Keith Brown and Tom Riley. Dr. Brown is Associate Professor of Sociology at St. Joe's. Shout out to the Sociology Department. And Tom's the President of the Connelly Foundation, a friend and partner of St. Joe's University, and certainly extremely generous philanthropist. Before we jump into our main content, we want to involve and engage each of you to frame our conversation. So we're going to be sending poll questions throughout the 1 hour. We welcome you to take part in this first anonymous poll, and the question should pop up on your screen momentarily. So we'll give you all a minute to fill that out, but I am going to continue on. One value that was so important to me as a student at St. Joe's, and I know is so important to current students, is the topic of being a hawk with and for others. So a few ways that this can be brought to fruition is through sharing of gifts and talents, pursuing social justice, and certainly having concern for the marginalized. Philanthropy is something we can all take part in and have an impact regardless of how much money we each have. For so many today, times are tough financially, and as we near year end, certainly the holiday season, those asks are going to begin hitting our inboxes, both virtually and physically. So what causes are each of you most passionate about? As inequalities in society are seen and felt now more than ever, what is each of your capacity to give? How will you determine who needs your support most right now? So let's explore these questions and so much more together. Few logistical points, and then we're going to take a peek at the poll. Later this hour, we're going to address some of your questions that you submitted during registration and even through this morning. If you have any questions throughout the course of the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will answer them if we have time at the end or send out short responses and summaries after the presentation. Please include your name, your location, and the graduation year if you are in fact a hawk. All right, it looks like our first poll results are in. So for what type of causes do you primarily donate to? It's really a split screen here, but more than half of the group does not donate to multiple causes. So that's interesting. Maybe they have one passion or effort that that most pulls them in. Then second, we see education and school. So likely a lot of hawks giving back to the university so other students can have that same experience. Not seeing much for social justice efforts. I think we're going to see that take off, especially in this upcoming year. And then virtually no one in the group does not donate. So we definitely like to see that.
Can we make a shared commitment today to work on the person who clicked I do not donate, right? That could be our aspiration for today. If we can convert that person into a donor.
I love that, Tom. Yeah, and even if it's just starting with $5, $10, those are the donations to me at the youth center that mean the most. We'll have, an elderly woman send a $5 check, and that's so powerful to me that she's committed to the mission and doing, the most that she's able to. All right, we're going to jump into some questions and hear from Tom and Dr. Brown. So I'm excited for that. Let's start off by setting the stage a bit here. So for those that aren't as familiar with the topic, we're going to start with what motivates people to give to an organization. So why is this important for organizations to know and recognize these behaviors? So I'd love to hear from both of you on this, Tom and Dr. Brown.
I'll go first, if that's all right, Tom.
Go for it.
Okay. I want to start with a premise, and the premise is that people do not donate to the causes that are most in need, right? It would be great if that was the case, right? But there is competition for our resources, and as any executive director of a nonprofit will tell you, or any student who's taking a social problems class, what is most newsworthy or framed as most problematic in the moment is not always where our money is directed. So what does motivate giving? Most of my talk, it's going to circle back to two themes. Not my talk, our conversation, I'm sorry. The first is kind of emotional and social, and that is people want to feel part of a community. So if they give, they want to know other people are giving as well. They do not want to be the one person who donates to X charity. That sense of we-ness is important, and we can foster that in different ways, and I'm sure Tom and Kristen both do so. And the second theme that shapes a lot of charitable giving, so the first is more social, emotional. If I give, will others too? The second is, will my money go where it's supposed to go or where it's intended to go? And this is a more rational calculation where givers will look, what are the administrative costs of the organization? Is all the money going to overhead, or is it actually going to the people it's intended to go to? So I think these two themes, these broad themes, kind of a sense of we-ness or community around giving being very important, but also a rational calculation eventually into, will my money go where I expect it to go? Do I trust the organization is an important factor there as well.
And that transparency is huge for a donor, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. How about you, Tom?
Well, I want to second what you said, Kristen, earlier about how well organized the St. Joe's crew has been in putting this together. So thanks for that. I feel a little bad. You guys all have your official Hawk affiliations, and I'm more of just a well-wisher. I do have an early connection with St. Joe's, which was, I went to high school across the street, which is now part of the campus, and we used to cut class to go over to St. Joe's and smoke cigarettes during the day. So that was a very early and fond introduction to Hawk Hill. That being said, back to the topic. Back to the topic. I agree with everything that Keith said. It is a really interesting kind of. The charitable sector is really big. It's hundreds of billions of dollars a year. I mean, it's not some trivial thing involving some pennies in the poor box. It's great that people are studying it more and that it's become more of a subject of academic understanding and motivation as to why people give and what those things are, as opposed to, I don't think it was studied as seriously in the past as it is now. So it's great that focus and attention is on such an important sector. Again, I agree with everything Keith said. I have kind of like a informal, I guess you'd say, spectrum of giving motivations, and it starts, I guess it'd be sort of four categories. And the first one would be sort of immediate or transactional giving. And that is, you see something in the news, or you see somebody approaches you, or there's something that just captures you at that moment. Maybe it's a great fundraising pitch, maybe it's something that you care about, and you write a check or hit send on something and you give, and that's going to give you some positive feeling. You feel connected, or you're doing something. that's kind of the immediate or transactional one. The second one would be something that might be a little bit more sustained. It might be a cause. You talked about social justice causes or something, or it could be something with an end in mind. Sometimes that could be a political campaign or something like that. That would be sort of, I guess, what you would call the cause or end-based giving. The third one, and this is particularly important for schools and universities or things like that, I would call kind of affiliative giving. You know, I give to this because that's kind of who I am. It's part of my identity. My kids would say it's part of my brand. You know, that's I'm affiliated with it. They're affiliated with me. It's just something I do. They're part of what I do. And then I think that fourth level, the farthest on that continuum, and that's one that I'm really interested in, and that we spend a lot of time with at the foundation, is more of like a partnership level. You know, the idea of we have me or us and this institution or this cause have shared goals. I'm not just writing a check. I'm involved. I care about how they operate. I'm not just concerned about their overhead. I mean, again, Kristen will talk later about the transparency that you mentioned, which is, you know, revolutionizing giving. But this idea of partnership where I'm not just writing a check now. I plan to be involved next year and 5 years and 10 years from now. And I care about the future of this institution or this cause. And I want to bring other people to it. I want to bring not just my money, but like myself to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's when you talk to motivation, like why people are giving, that's like the one that is the most meaningful and produces the most engagement.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. These are all great points. A follow-up to that, we'll keep this conversation going and then move on, was some examples. What are examples of typical giving behaviors and the impact that that has on an organization? So we definitely at Lucy see some behaviors that are being repeated by certain donors, and then others it's seemingly very random. So I was sharing earlier, we had an example with unfortunately, our shed was broken into and all of the youth bikes were taken. We're the only youth bike share program in the city, and had a top CEO from the region just do a $5,000 donation on the website the minute it hit a media story. And I was thinking, like, this guy's got to be a cyclist. Like, there's got to be some connection to biking, or, you know, what pulled at his heartstrings and made him want to give to that, and maybe never has for us before and never will again. Can you all share a few examples of some of those behaviors or things that you've seen in your career, Tom, maybe?
Sure. I actually, I'm going to start with kind of a negative one, which is, and this is, again, you were talking before about there's individual giving, there's corporate giving, there's private, there's professional philanthropy giving, and that's the part that I'm involved with. I do have to correct you earlier. You characterized me as generous. I'm not generous. This is my job. The original donors to the foundation were generous. You know, they're the people who gave the money, and I just have the really incredible good fortune of being able to direct it to things here in the Philadelphia area that I think are consistent with their philosophy. But one of the things for institutional donors, and Kristen, I know this is going to resonate with you, is a big impediment for people is their ego. They kind of need. There's a big problem in foundation giving, I think, with thinking that you know what's best. Since you're the one who's writing the check, you try to get the person at the nonprofit to do the thing that you know is right, rather than listening to the person who's doing the actual work.
Well, and that's so stressful as an executive director for someone to come at us with so many restrictions and here, like, we need the staff to run the programs. We need to keep the bills paid to have the building be open. So many of those things, everyone wants what's kind of fun and shiny, and we don't need 30 computer labs. We don't need. So it's definitely a frustration on our end, but there's that happy medium of really wanting to make sure that the donor is happy with that relationship and able to determine where their money goes, but that we're not looking at 20 restrictions and have virtually no unrestricted funds to utilize.
And it's really hard for you to say, no, I don't want because you need the money. and you want the gift and you want their involvement, but that's a real issue, I think, in this field. I think that must be something you have to wrestle with all the time.
Yeah, you can't really say no because you never know who you say no to might end up being one of the best allies down the road.
And you're usually being motivated from a genuine desire to help. But
Absolutely.
again, it's very hard for people to hear. Again, one of the things that we always try to challenge ourselves with, and this came back from our original donor, he was a big believer in not micromanaging people who are doing the actual work. His point was, I do the hard work of identifying the best leaders. Find, like that is hard work,
Sure.
but find the people who are the best leaders who are doing the great work, then honor, give them the resources they need, and then get out of the way and let them do the work that they're doing.
Yeah, we've been so blessed with a few donors that are just such humble, generous, trusting supports that are like, you're the experts on the youth and on the program and on the work you're doing, and we're going to follow suit with that and support you in whatever you need. And that's really rewarding and takes a long time to get there. But all right, this has been a great opening. Let's explore a little bit deeper, kind of that philanthropic decision making. So in terms of giving habits and how they might have changed due to the pandemic, and I know this is something the three of us had discussed when we had talked previously, but what seems to be kind of how COVID is impacting everything. And I know in a lot of these virtual sessions, it's something that keeps coming up. And yeah, it's exhausting, COVID. But for organizations like ours, it is such a huge factor. So we are going to pull up another poll just to hear from each of you. And then I would love to hear from Tom and Dr. Brown on that as well. So really looking at if your charitable giving habits have changed because of COVID-19. I do want to apologize. Earlier on the poll, I did misread that it was in fact that the majority of the group did give to quite a few, to multiple organizations. So I apologize for that. Yeah, so interesting. We're definitely seeing that quite a few are donating more than they had been previously. You wonder if that's more time on social media, watching the news, having these difficult discussions with family and friends, really just realizing how serious that need is, or feeling for nonprofits and organizations that are in jeopardy of having to close temporarily or permanently because of the funding. One thing I noticed, I would love, Tom and Dr. Brown, your perspective on this, but there are all of these COVID relief and recovery grants now, which is awesome, but they might be taking the place of funding going elsewhere.
Go ahead, Tom. I'll let you take.
I'm happy to, but I feel like I'm hogging the mic. Are you sure you don't want to go?
I am totally fine. I know what I'm going to say next. You're good.
Right. Okay. One of the things I just want to mention was the, we talk about the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit. You're talking about nonprofits generally. People donate. It's such a broad field. There's so many different. There's such a broad field, and a lot of the things that are in the headlines about COVID, and should be, are having very different experiences than other kinds of nonprofits. Let me give you just kind of two examples. Obviously, food is a huge part of the COVID problem. There was something in the Inquirer the other day that 1/4 of all Philadelphians have had a charitably donated meal during this time. That's just a huge number of people who are suffering food insecurity and anxiety, and it's coming from a lot of different angles. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, some of the food providing nonprofits, I don't want to mischaracterize this when I say they're doing well. They're incredibly stressed. It's hard for them to get food. But in terms of resources and donations, they're doing really well because people are identifying this as the serious problem it is. Some of them, and the ones who are larger and more sophisticated, are getting big federal grants too, and state grants, because people are recognizing how big of a problem it is. They're stretched to the limits, but they're not stretched to the limits in terms of their funding they're getting right now. At the other end of the spectrum, you have cultural organizations, some of which people might even think of as, well, they're not really, but I think of as like helping the poor nonprofits. These are cultural organizations. They're just being destroyed.
The
I mean,
art.
if your model is based on ticket sales, you might have had predictions in your budget for what happened, worst case scenarios, but nobody's worst case scenario was zero. Nobody had a budget scenario of zero and looking like zero heading into next year. And a lot of them, you talk to a lot of these organizations, some are big, some are small, some are trying as hard as they can to be creative, doing online things. It's no substitute in terms of running them as organizations. And now they're it's not like the lights flip back on as soon as the numbers are better. Who's going to go? They've had to lay off a lot of people who have now moved on to other things. You can't just start it, flip a switch and turn back on again. If you're booking events or other things, it's months or a year out. A lot of these cultural organizations are looking at turning back on in 2022.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're going to blink out of existence. So, how are people adapting right now? Again, I love the fact that so many people are in the moment and are helping the most vulnerable with food and direct services. We increased our budget our donation budget by 50% this year.
Wow.
Just for COVID relief in Philadelphia, and I know other people are doing that too. But that's where the fire and the emergency is. There's a huge part of the nonprofit world that isn't what we think of as like the front line, but they're getting killed.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point.
Have
you seen any research, Dr. Brown, or what are you seeing on your side from kind of a sociological perspective?
Well, I'll circle back to Tom's points and agree wholeheartedly first, and then I'll come back and give a little data. This gets at that issue, like those most in need aren't necessarily getting that money. And Tom's exactly right. The arts community, the local arts community, the national arts community is decimated. I heard an interview, talk about real research here, Kristen. Yeah. I heard an interview with Bruce Springsteen yesterday.
Yes, the boss.
Yeah, and with your Jersey roots, I had to bring it up. He said just what Tom said. We don't expect major live performances until 2022, and smaller artists, this is brutal. I'll make two more points. I very much agree with Tom's continuum from a transactional relationship to a partnership. And I want to give one example because Tom brought up food insecurity in Philadelphia. This is the area I've been doing research the last few years. And just to give one highlight of an example, I'm thinking of the soup kitchen in the city where somebody has been off and on receiving aid from that soup kitchen for the last 15 years. And he had this line about this organization has treated him so well that every time he's employed, he spends each weekend working at the same soup kitchen where he receives aid when he's unemployed. I want to give one big picture stat, and then I'll pass back to you guys. I looked at the Great Recession to see how giving changed from 2008 to 2009. And we saw over that 1 year, probably the worst years in terms of measuring the change from the economic collapse from the Great Recession. We saw an 8% decrease in charitable giving from 2008 to 2009. And then we saw a return to 2008 numbers 3 years later. So it took 3 years for charitable giving to get where it had been before. But what these numbers hide is what we've talked about here, right? Charitable giving, because of the pandemic, is going to shift. So this is going to, in some ways, benefit some organizations, and really others will struggle greatly. So that's an aspect of these stats that's kind of hidden.
Yeah, I love that. There's a great question that just popped up that I would love to hear from you two on, but Jerry Burton had a great point about using charity navigators and looking at profiles and compensation of the CEO and really using those ratings to determine where she gives. What are you two's thoughts on that? I thought that was a great question.
Go ahead, Tom.
First?
No, go for it.
Okay, I have a little bit of a countercultural answer on that. I think that the transparency that those services provides is fantastic and is really it's an improvement that that happens more and more. both in terms of institutional donors and in terms of individuals, learning more about them, more transparency, the more transparency for nonprofits on both sides, givers and donors, the better for everybody. So I love that part of it. I mean, that's getting better all the time. If you want to do the work, you can find out what you need to know in a way that you never could before. And that's great. And it's also great in terms of breaking down what I have always thought of as another, inequity in terms of institutional giving, which is a nonprofit, crafts a proposal based on very little information about the foundation or corporation or donor, and they kind of write a proposal and throw it over the wall, and they hope that a check is going to come back, but they don't know. So that the more transparency that we can provide, the more communication, the better. So that part's all great. Here's where the countercultural part comes in. A lot of these things that are about there's been this big push towards metrics, towards being able to exactly rate different nonprofits and different and I think sometimes it's like a false precision, and it's making people chase metric, chase statistics rather than keep their eye on the prize of what they're trying to do.
Right.
And it can make people waste a lot of their time. And I think it also fits into that spectrum or continuum we were talking about too. For things like very specific outcomes, that's great for your immediate or your transactional donor. That's great. They feel good about it. Check written. I feel good. Nonprofit got the money. We're doing great. But as you guys were both talking about before, the partnership level of giving, the partnership level of giving isn't about like these exact metrics and who makes how much and stuff like that. And it's a lot more about giving to the less glamorous things. I mean, Kristen, you were talking earlier about everybody might want to give to the shiny object instead of to the unglamorous thing, like giving to endowment or giving to general operating support or giving to help you pay staff or pay your attorney's fees, all these things that nobody wants to give to. It's not fun or glamorous, but you need it.
Right.
To do the work.
And how do we as the organization package it so it is appealing to the donor?
Exactly that, but there are things that operating costs are not an evil thing. That's your work. You have to have an employee benefits program.
But the grant still wanted to fall under programmatic and be tied into direct impact with the youth. Well, of course, the metrics on Salesforce are directly impacting the youth because we're using those metrics to measure our successes, or keeping the building running is serving these hundreds of youth. So it is, I find myself, and certainly our development coordinator as well, having to really reframe and be able to defend and explain that in a way that funders want to hear it.
I wish, I think this conversation would be more fun if we were fighting more, but we seem to be on the same page a little too often. I think these charities,
half an hour left. We'll find something.
Yeah, great. I think these charity kind of assessments, I agree with everything you're both saying. I think they tap into that ideal for consumers or individuals instead of at the organizational level to have a rational evaluation of where their money's going. And like Tom, I agree with that. Let me give an example. The Susan G. Komen Foundation tapped into kind of the emotional, social aspect of giving for breast cancer in an extraordinary way, right? Their walks created a sense of community. They raised a social problem to national attention that was not receiving very much attention prior to their work. So that emotional, social aspect, they excelled in. But over time, as they grew, some of these they received critiques for administrative overhead and paying executives a little too much money and putting a pink ribbon on cancer-causing products, right? Which is, kind of a problem. You're endorsing this product and yet it causes cancer. So what I'm getting at is, and eventually the Komen Foundation in the last few years has responded to this, and they've moved back up these rankings of these, assessments. But I think it is to get back to the main problem. I think there is a problem when the organization shifts their focus instead of dealing with the social problems to dealing with a metric or a ranking or a form of assessment. There is value in it, but it also leads to organizations just reproducing themselves instead of focusing on the problems.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna pivot, gonna change topics a little bit, but have one great question that we had discussed before today, kind of on United States has very high rates of giving. I had read various articles with, numbers varying from 50 to 70% on any given year. Um, can you speak to why this is such a big part of our national culture and how these giving patterns change regionally and nationally? That one's for you, Dr. Brown, but yeah, be interested to hear why you think that it is such a high rate in our country.
So we should take great pride in this. It's exciting. It's great. It's, something we can rally around. At the same time, I think we should be embarrassed by it. And the reason I say we should be embarrassed is we are one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of wealth or income. We're up there with China, Russia, South Africa, Brazil. And by many of these measures, we are the most unequal country in the world. To give a kind of story that bears out this need, right, for Americans to be charitable. My wife and I, this is about 15 years ago, we were at a cafe and we were in Europe. It's the only time I've been to Europe, so I don't go to Europe. I went to Europe. And a homeless man came up to us and started asking us for money. And he looked like he was dealing with addiction. It looked pretty clear. And the owner of the cafe was sitting with us. He came out, he knew we were Americans and he just wanted to talk and we were having a great night. When this man came up to our table, the owner berated him. I mean, he really got in his face and said, back off, and said, get away from here. And my wife and I were like, oh my gosh, this is totally awkward. We thought this was a nice restaurant owner. And he comes back and sits to us and he said, I know you think I'm a jerk, and I still do think he was a jerk, but and he's like, but the reason I pushed him away is our taxes pay for him to have enough money to have an apartment, right? He's not homeless. He has a subsidy for an apartment, and he has a subsidy for addiction treatment. And he said, if you give him money, it'll probably go to fund his addiction. Now, putting all that aside, the bigger point is consistent with the data, which is because our social safety net is so weak in the United States compared to other industrialized countries, we have to give. I mean, we don't have a choice. Our healthcare, our cash assistance, our need for food insecurity being so high, because of these problems, we don't really have a choice. So we should be proud of this, but at the same time, there's a reason why this has to happen.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, can I jump into, I'm not gonna go so far as to say I have a disagreement, because that's an extremely accurate portrait. But a little different perspective too is Americans are very generous, and you're right, but it's baked into I don't want to leave the impression that it's just filling gaps. It's baked into our civic DNA from the beginning. I mean, this is back to when Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America in 1835. He was astounded at Americans' voluntary activities. I mean, it was more of a frontier mentality. I'm not comparing it to today, but it's almost 200 years later, and charity is such a huge factor of what we do. But I think it helps explain how we got to where we are, which is that Americans, more than any other country, spontaneously formed voluntary organizations and charity organizations. And you're right, in the early days of a new country, healthcare was a charity, education was a charity. The school in the picture in the virtual background behind you is a private charitable organization. Mm-hmm. It's really kind of a remarkable thing. And you're right, the Europeans are stunned that we don't pay for so many of the things that they think of as part of the social safety net. And we do this way. I'm not saying that it's the best way to do it. I am saying that it's part of the American civic DNA. An interesting twist on that, or like an interesting thing to think about. I spent a lot of time I have to make sure not to use the L word, lobbying, educating congressional staffers and people about the importance of charitable giving, and not, there was some talk about eliminating the charitable deduction in the last round of tax revision, which would have been a catastrophe, I think. But anyway, the point of the story is that in talking to a lot of the tax writers and tax theorists, the idea of charitable giving was present at the beginning of the income tax. And here's what I'm getting at. A lot of us think that the charitable deduction is like an incentive to give, and it is. And people, but I don't think it's a primary motivation for most people. But what's interesting is the theory isn't. I mean, it didn't start out with how do we incentivize people to give. The theory was money that you voluntarily give away to help all these social problems is money that you never spent on yourself. It doesn't count as income because you never brought it into yourself for consumption. It's expected that people are going to give money away before they take it to themselves. And that's something that's really American. And that's something that I think you're right. You started out by saying it's something that we should be proud of, that we do see it as an expectation that, oh, if you've made money, it's not just a nice thing to do, or it's not just something that tax code incentivizes you to do. It's expected that you're supposed to help other people. Now, you're the one who picks whether you think it should be A, B, or C, but that's part of your civic responsibility. Everybody's counting on you to do that. And where the line is between what's government and what's private is an ongoing conversation that's been happening, a political conversation that's been happening for 200 years, and should be a main part of our political discourse. I mean, that's what we should be talking about.
Right. What's your plea to the previous poll, likely a student that is not yet giving? Kind of what's your plea to that likely student in terms of starting to think about that upon graduation?
I wonder if that person actually isn't giving him or herself enough credit. I bet that they are giving. They're probably giving time.
Sure. Which is even more important.
Yeah. I also like the honesty.
Yes, I love the honesty. I
think they just hit the wrong button.
I just assumed it was a student, because that would have been my answer during college, is like you're saying, Tom, you wouldn't have thought about the thousands of hours of, weekly service learning, service immersion that I did throughout college. Didn't even occur to me. It was that I can't give $20, so I'm not giving back to my school or giving to a cause. So that's, some great points. This next question is for you also, Tom, but kind of what are some of the recent trends that we're seeing with nonprofits and charities in terms of implementing reach with new donors or raising engagement among those donors?
We were kind of joking about this before the session started, which is I'm really impressed that all the audience that are here. I mean, who isn't trying to avoid more webinars and online Zoom classes and things like that? And the fact that people are coming shows a genuine interest, and it shows like a real a commitment. It's impressive on the part of the people who put this together, and it's impressive people who are taking their time right now between 12 and 1 to listen to that. And one of the reasons, and that does go to answer your question, Kristen, which is there is a fierce competition right now. I'm not talking about over the last few years. I'm talking about over the COVID period. There's a aggressive, fierce competition for people's attention. And it's so, think back, go back to your emails after this is over, not during the session, and look at your emails from last January and February. And I guarantee you're going to find organizations and causes and things you cared a lot about then that you're like, oh yeah, I haven't thought about them in a long time. I wonder how they're doing. Or I wonder how, gosh, it seems like 10 years ago. So there's this incredibly fierce competition for our attention right now. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of, and I guess we all have, is people trying to engage us through fun. It's an online wine tasting. It's a virtual, there's some kind of game or competition or something that is going to not just speak to our sense of of compassion or social justice that we're doing, but also something saying, we recognize how little you want to go online for another session, but we're going to make it fun for you. And we're going to make it. What can we do to make this something that engages you and that makes it worth your time?
Sure.
I don't know if that's going to go away. I think that competition for our attention and for our sense of not just sole purpose, but keeping our limited attention when they can get it. That's gonna stay, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And a follow-up to that, how do those motivations and behaviors change between a one-time donor and a repeat donor? How does that look different?
That's tough. That's tough. It's a great question. Most of my early research was on fair trade. So I was looking at products that are sold that a portion of the proceeds go to a given cause, right? So I was using fair trade as a case study to say, to look at things like Alex's Lemonade or like countless different products where a piece of the profits go to a cause. And the danger with that form of giving is twofold. One is not a large amount of money necessarily goes to a given cause, and additionally, there may not be transparency into how much even goes to that cause. It also allows consumers to make a one-off purchase and have no other investment in the cause whatsoever. So that's the critical way of looking at this. And early researchers said, not only this is a problem, right? So you could have the fear was that people would say, oh, well, I bought my fair trade coffee, so I don't have to give to any other local organizations. We call this sometimes licensing. More recently, scholars think that is not really the case. And what's instead happening is more similar to what Tom was calling earlier, like affiliative giving. So by buying a fair trade coffee or supporting X, Y, or Z, it's a way for consumers to make and remake their identity. It's a way for them to say, I'm this type of person. I want to be better. I know this is not going to save the world, but this is better than the alternative product that's next to it on the shelf. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, the quest is, how do you get those more meaningful relationships that a lot of nonprofits are striving for? How do you create a more meaningful connection with your donors?
Right. I love that. Going back, Tom, to something we talked about a little bit earlier, but the donor that's like, this $10 goes to this pair of shoes for this youth with this name living at this address. $100,000 donation to this computer lab that will be located in this new section of the building, which will be built on this date. Just really those restrictions and specifications. Why do you feel like that's a trend, that's the way that donors really want to see things going? And how can organizations structure that donation language, to my question earlier, of how we present ourselves to say, like, listen, we're meeting the needs and doing what you want us to be doing, but we also have to keep in mind that we can't do computer labs for all 5 of you, because we don't need computer labs for all 5.
This is really important stuff. It goes to the commodification of generosity, the commodification of charitable giving, not just the money part, but the things that Keith is talking about in terms of, why do you give to begin with? Putting it into those kind of formats is the way of the world. That's what we're expecting in our restaurants. That's what we're expecting in all the other, things that we consume or purchase. We expect more transparency, more information, more like I get to see exactly where things go, and people are sort of demanding accountability. And nonprofits, in competition with each other, are smart and wise to put it out that way, and they feel pressure to. But it also is very effective for those, transactional donors and new donors.
Yeah.
Kristen, your question is, how do you then evolve those donors into somebody who's going to help you in the way that you need the most, as opposed to the shiny object?
Yeah.
And you have everybody has so many needs that are unglamorous, and that the new person doesn't want to think that they're giving to, but that you need money for it also. Yeah. I tend to think that those come from cultivating relationships. And I know it's well, everybody's like, well, duh, obviously, but it's true. If you look at some of the people who are the most successful nonprofit leaders, I mean, the person I have in mind is somebody who I think most people here know of, Sister Mary Scullion at Project Home. She's a miracle worker, not just in terms of what she does to help the needy, but in terms of the way that she has cultivated a cadre of wealthy donors to be part of her mix. And she now has relationships with people that are based on like so much personal time, so much personal effort, so much getting to know people and being part of their lives, that when she goes to them and says, look, we've got a problem, somebody, we need to come up with $50,000 to pay for you know, a new back office or something that nobody else would want to give to. She can get people to do that, but it took unimaginable amounts of time to build those personal relationships. Is that possible for everybody? Is that like a blueprint for everyone? No, but it does show that it is possible to do. And it's moving them from being somebody who gave once because, as you said, a check for this amount will serve X number of meals, or to somebody who just says, I know and trust and respect you, and I'm giving you this check to spend as you see fit. It doesn't happen on its own. I wish it did, but it takes a lot of that personal development work.
Yeah, we're going into our first ever capital campaign right now, building our Dream Youth Center, breaking ground this spring. But yeah, I wonder in the budget, you know, you're going to have donors say, I don't want to give to the contingency fee or operational or this or that. Like, I want to be the entranceway, the lobby, the computer lab, the industrial kitchen for meals. And it's just getting creative. So we'll have a follow-up chat.
I always wonder who those donors think the sucker is, who's giving for the contingency. The sucker is actually the person who's your best friend, you know, who's your best donor, who's the person who actually respects your mission and your work.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't happen with a brochure. It happens with personal relationships, and that's hard.
I think we have time for one or two more, and then hopefully we can hear from the audience for a few minutes. I love the question on spending ethically and what the consumer or donor might be looking for in an organization to give to that's ethical spending. So tips for donors that are trying to evaluate that. We're in an interesting and a tough time right now in our country. And obviously ethics are at the forefront of so many things that are going on, from Black Lives Matter to elections to really, that's such a hot button topic. Can either of you speak to kind of what that ethical decision making looks like and give any tips or advice to some of our audience today on that?
I teach a class on ethical consumption, which is a little different than ethical giving. But there is a long history in this country of using products or as a means to give to a cause, including, the abolitionist movement had free produce, which meant that you could buy produce in Baltimore and Philadelphia that didn't go to support slavery, right? Which is sadly, the movement was, by most measures, a failure, right? It didn't have a major economic impact in reducing slavery in the South. But if you want to broaden your horizons and think what is success in a movement like this in terms of ethical spending, you could say it was successful in that moment of allowing people to reproduce their identity as an abolitionist, right? So it has a very limited economic impact in this instance, but a very positive cultural impact. These movements are tough, right? I mean, there's so much, we've talked about this 2 or 3 times today, there's so much competition for our dollars. And when you start adding charitable giving to, say, voting with your dollar, whether it's organic or fair trade, there's even more competition, right? And quick competition. And a lot of it's simply fraudulent, right? Using marketing as a means to make you feel good, but have very little money go to a given cause. So as with all of this, it's that push to do your homework. And that sounds so simple. And it's just not. It's hard to do this type of work. It's hard to figure out if you donate to eliminate food insecurity in Philadelphia. Well, you may donate a couple bags of food, but your food may not be what the local community wants to eat, right? So it actually would have been better if you just donated cash to that food pantry.
Yeah.
Furthermore, maybe
We get a lot of casseroles of chili, and chili is the only item that the youth will not eat.
And I'm sure you're grateful on one level, and then you want to shake the donor on another, and maybe you can't even say yes to that in a public forum, but that is the tension.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. Anything else to add, Tom? And then we are going to head to an audience question.
Well, it's been such an interesting conversation, and I noticed that we're getting closer to the end. So I'm going to cheat a tiny bit and give my kind of, you mentioned in the beginning the idea of like what any concluding thoughts, but my concluding thought I think answers this question a little bit. And that's that, and it's not a new idea. It's actually a really old idea. And I feel it might be, I would usually feel as a little subversive, except for the fact that this is a Catholic college. And it's an idea that is kind of at the heart of Catholic social teaching, and has a real subtle power to it too. And it's this concept of subsidiarity. Mm-hmm. Subsidiarity is this idea that the most effective, I'm going to simplify it, but the most effective giving is personal, person to person, and at arm's length. So, it sounds ironic in a rapidly shrinking world to think this way, but if you want to get to both ethical giving and effective giving, international institutions, there's, as you said, there's a lot of homework involved, and there's a lot of hope and a lot of guessing. National, a little bit less, still more. State level, city level, personal. Now you can get into levels where you actually know the people. It's not just some abstract thing, and that you hope that X percentage of your money goes towards the thing that you're hoping that it goes to, and maybe you feel good about yourself for doing it. But if you really want the accountability part, you're giving to things that are in your backyard. You're giving, and it's people that you know, it's people that you should know, it's people that might live a few miles away from you, but might be living very different lives. Here's your chance to help, but also to then really know where your dollars are going to. Right. If I knew you, Kristen, from what you were doing, and you knew me well enough to say like, hey, enough with the chili, nobody wants that. But what we do, that could never happen in a non-dialogue that takes place at a national or international level, but it could happen when you get to know people. And that goes to what Keith was talking about it's hard work, but it's work that you can do. Yeah. So the more that you can know where your money's going, because you know it's a local cause, a local, something that you care about, to local people that you can be involved with, you're going to have the ethical part because you're going to know the people. B, it goes to Kristen's point about this, now we know each other, and you're more likely to give to the stuff that I actually need as opposed to the thing that you think I need. And C, this goes back to our first question that you brought up, which is, why do people give? They want to do something. I hope it's because they want to do something that makes things better. Boy, you can see it if it's something that's in front of you, as opposed to some abstract international concept, however important it is. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. All right, I'm going to toss it to Stacy for a few minutes before we close out. I believe Stacy has one or two audience questions. I see a few popping up.
Yes, I'm going to go with the first one. So our submitter works at an institution for which alumni express great admiration, but that is not necessarily reflected in giving amounts or participation. How does one translate that affection into higher levels of giving?
Do you want me to start, or Tom, do you want to start?
Go ahead.
Truth be told, I hate when so-called experts will speak out of turn, and this isn't my area. The thing I would say is, you need a meaningful connection, that sense of community. How do you foster that alumni community? And the devil's in the details. And I'm hesitant to speak on this because I don't want to give misinformation. We're starting a new coffee program at St. Joe's where we're donating, it's called SJ Brew, where we're donating profits to send students on Pell Grants to Latin America. And one of the main goals of this is to create solidarity with Nicaraguan coffee farmers, but additionally, it's a way to simply reify the connection between St. Joe's students and our alumni, as well as farmers in Latin America. So I don't know, and I would love to know if this has an impact on giving in recreating somebody's identity as an alumni of the university. But data-wise, I can't say for sure. So I'll pass it to Tom.
This is a very typical problem, which is people take things for granted. It's human nature. So you're like, oh yeah, I went there, that was awesome. But unless there had never been an effort to, at the beginning, say, no, and when you move on, you were going to have an obligation to give back. That's part of what our expectations for you are. It's just, yeah, I assume it's fine. I mean, a really proximate example is Catholic schools here in Philadelphia. Until recently, most of them not only were getting almost no money from their alumni, they didn't even know who their alumni was. A few years ago, one of the big Catholic high schools that has tens of thousands of, maybe hundreds of thousands of graduates over the last over 100 years, they were asked what their alumni database was, and they didn't know how to answer. And they wound up saying, oh, the receptionist has an index card box, and I think that's got the names of the graduates in it. Oh, but she lost it. And so no wonder they were getting no money from tens of thousands of graduates, because nobody really asked them, and nobody at the time said, when you graduate, it's going to be expected that as you, and you need to tell those stories, and you need to give the examples of this room was donated by so-and-so who graduated in this year. He went on, or she had gone on to make this money in this way, and as a good person does, they gave back to. Now that's hard to retcon, but it is, going forward, I think it's a question for organizations that have graduates, is to set expectations that if we think this is going to be valuable in your life, if you find it to be that way, we need you.
Love that. Thanks, Tom. I'm just going to close out before we say our thank yous and goodbyes. Dr. Brown, did you have any closing thoughts to add in as Tom shared as well?
I mean, I would echo a lot of what we're saying here. I mean, and just to build on Tom's last point, this is a combination of creating meaningful stories, right, that allow people to feel they're part of something bigger than themselves. And so if you're saying, I want to fight poverty in Camden, right, that's not really going to work. But if you tell a story about an individual who's benefited from your organization and how, and it allows people to feel connected. It allows people to feel like they're making a tangible difference. So this is a requirement of a lot of homework, right? Because there's so much competition here. So there's a rational aspect to this, but storytelling matters, and telling great detailed stories will create more meaningful connections. It's really that Jesuit ideal of being with and for others, right? Not an exploitative relationship, but a real walk with somebody else kind of relationship.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you both so much. It was such a pleasure to moderate and discuss and hear all of your insight and expertise. Definitely hope to keep in touch and continue this relationship, and hopefully we can follow up with some of the additional questions in an email. But I just wanted to close out today's session by saying thank you to all of the attendees. Remind you that this is a recorded webinar, and we will be sharing it on the SJU.edu Unlimited Learning website. And we really appreciate the great conversation, the time, attention, and participation from each of you. Stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be consumer behavior and the retail experience. And at that same website, sju.edu/unlimited learning, you'll be able to register for that as well. Again, I'm Kristen Prinn. Check us out, lucyoutreach.org, or come visit us in Camden. Class of 2004, so proud to be a part of St. Joe's University and all the great work that Hot Kill is doing. So everyone have a wonderful weekend. And Tom and Dr. Brown, thanks again for your time.